Good afternoon, everybody. We have over 600 people registered, so Monica and I will do a little bantering here as we allow people to filter in. Uh,
Oh,
so,
we
good
have our
afternoon,
first
Monica.
question.
Yeah,
John, we have our first question. Welcome,
yeah.
everybody.
Good. You know what's funny? We've been doing so many of these, we didn't even talk about who was taking the lead this time. We sort of have it organized, like you want to start or I'll start or whatever. But let's just dig right in. So yeah, let's just start. Obviously, welcoming everybody. Happy to have you folks here once again for us to sit and do our sort of less formal discussion of the settlement practice changes and the forms changes and our path forward as the deadline for these August 14th is coming up soon. But before we do all of that, let's just talk about our rules of the road. As we've always handled these, the chat is disabled for you folks. We will do Q&A. We're not going, don't raise your hands. We're not going to be unmuting anyone and taking live questions that way. Just type your questions into the Q&A. And as we go along, we'll answer questions, and we're going to leave plenty of time at the end of the session to answer questions. These slides are the same slides we've been using for our last few sessions, but it's important to continue to talk about these things as we continue to have questions or new things or new thoughts as you folks have sort of been digesting this, and especially with the new forms being available, at least in sample format. I think you folks have some questions related to those things. So it's good for us to sort of start with our usual overview and just move right into questions.
And John, if I could add two more quick little rules.
By all means.
I always have to interrupt you. You know that. So goes without saying. So this session, I know early on we weren't recording the sessions. Today's session is being recorded. So you probably already heard that button when you logged in. And then if you do have questions, as John said, put them in the Q&A. But as the person who already asked the first question did, if you're feeling shy and don't want to use your name, use anonymous if you feel more comfortable asking a question that way. So, and we'll give
Great point.
We're really going to try and save a lot of time for questions, and we will give you some forms updates and talk about transition. But I'm going to let John go first because he's got the PowerPoint. So,
all right, let me share my screen and we'll dig right in. Okay, here we are. So let's just go in. So we know all about the settlement. We talked about the settlement. And so with the settlement, MLSs and in turn the brokerage customers of those MLSs are required to adhere to a number of what they're called practice changes. And so we're going to focus really on the two that are most impactful, that are going to really impact how you do business and how we as the MLS function. And as I had mentioned previously, the implementation date is August 14th. So that's a Wednesday. The settlement gave us up until August 17th to implement these changes. That's a Saturday. We didn't want to do it on Saturday. Wednesday seemed best. I've actually since found out a number of MLSs have already implemented these changes, and they're doing it over the next, this week, etc. So that'll be August 14th. And so what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, compensation is removed from the MLS. The compensation fields will be removed from all property types, single family, multifamily, land, etc. So all property types and all statuses. So we're not just talking about active listings, we're talking about off-market listings. You won't have the ability to look at sold listings and say, gee, what were people offering for compensation for sold listings last year? That information will be gone. In addition, you are prohibited from referencing compensation at all in the MLS. So while the fields are gone, you can't reference compensation or make offers of compensation, or even sort of veiled, not so cleverly disguised offers of compensation in the MLS using remarks or using document attachments or any of those things. You are not permitted to do that in any area of the MLS, not even in the list price. In some areas, the folks I've been reading are trying to get crafty where they, the last X number of digits on the, on the list price will be what we're offering, wink, wink. So that is going to be a problem. And so, as we said, nowhere in the MLS, the settlement does allow for the continued broker-to-broker compensation model outside of the MLS. But, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has made their position pretty clear on this, and that they feel that the offering of cooperative compensation is not good, and they would like to see that go away entirely. Sellers pay their brokers, buyers pay their brokers, and that, in their mind would be, amen, end of story. That's how it works. So I think that covers that. Monica, by all means, if there's anything you want to add, go ahead. If not, I'll just plow ahead. You're muted, by the way, Monica. So, sorry.
I'm off to a good start. I just got back from a short vacation and already blowing it. So, all right.
Wow. All right.
So we do have a few of these are the same theme, but there is one I just want to have you see if you want to tackle now. This is actually from the question that has to do with other things, that other sites that look like multiple listing services. So this one actually quotes from My State MLS that says that the cooperating broker changes and buyer broker changes apply to NAR members and affiliated boards. Co-broking is legal in all 50 states and is governed by license law, not NAR. And they're kind of touting the fact that statewide MLS is still allowing My State MLS is allowing a co-broke field. So
so here's the thing.
It's like, look, accurate. Is this accurate?
Yeah, so so there's obviously going to be opportunistic organizations that see that because of this settlement, they think there's a place for them to create their own vehicle for cooperative compensation. But let's be frank. There was just a lawsuit and a lot of large brokerages and the National Association that just lost a lawsuit based on the sharing of compensation. So it's clear that that there are parties out there who don't like it, whether you want to, whether you agree with them or not. And we're not taking a position on this, whether you agree with them or not. It's cost NAR and a lot of brokerages a lot of money because this cooperative, this quote unquote conspiracy to inflate commissions, right, as they're calling it. So the sharing of commissions artificially inflates the costs to sellers, right? I guess both home buyers and home sellers, depending on which lawsuit which side of the lawsuit you're on. But and the Department of Justice agrees. And so to the extent that someone is trying to create a national platform and proactively marketing, hey, look at that, they can't do it, but we can. How long do you think it's going to take before those same bodies go after this organization for the same exact reason? And so do you want to be a broker affiliated with that model, continuing the quote unquote conspiracy? Or do you want to recognize the fact that whether, again, we agree with it or not, that this is the new world we're living in, that the sharing of compensation in the old way is a problem. And so, you decide. You can do what you want. And as the person said, it is legal. And so you can continue to do it outside of the MLS. And until I suppose the Department of Justice somehow gets some sort of ban put on that nationally or whatever. I don't even know how that would work. I'm not the lawyer, Monica, you are. But if somehow they were able to create this, hey, listen, right away they have to, I forget the legal term for that, where they, would somehow, I guess, go to the Supreme Court and get this, national ban immediately on
just
sharing.
like an injunction or something.
Injunction, excuse me, that's the word. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. So, you do what you want in terms of your brokerage business models. We're not here to tell you how to do your business. We're telling you what the settlement is. And in this, at least from our MLS, these are the rules we have to abide by. And there are other ways to continue in this new model that continues to get buyers into homes and sellers selling their homes. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, sort of as we move forward, and probably answer your questions about, putting deals together and concessions and the new P&S agreement and all of those things.
And John, one more quick
Yep.
thought before you move on
Yep.
that. I just realized that we had not introduced ourselves.
We just assume everybody knows us. We've been doing so many of these things.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. We just launched into it. We feel like we
to
know all of you.
Well, it wasn't the first slide, right? So I'm John Breault, Vice President of MLS for statewide MLS and the Rhode Island Association of Realtors. Monica?
And I'm Monica Staaf, the General Counsel of the Rhode Island Association of Realtors and statewide MLS. So now back to you, John. But
so that's the other thing too. So there are also, one of the prohibitions on MLSs is that we shall not be a mechanism for the offer of compensation as well. So any sort of third-party site that's trying to establish the offer of compensation, if that site is getting a feed from the MLS, well, then the MLS pulls their feed. We are not permitted to give listings to any site looking to establish cooperative compensation. If you have an IDX site, you can put a compensation for your own listings on your IDX site and continue to get an IDX feed from MLS. But on your IDX site, you can't start putting, offers of compensation for all the listings on your site and try to establish some sort of mechanism for that, sharing of compensation. Then we would have to, pull your IDX feed. So, okay, so we'll move ahead. I'm sure we'll have more questions sort of related to that. But I mean, the bottom line, I guess, with this is like, and I think we'll see a lot of people sort of trying to hang on to the old way and sort of figure out ways to do that. But is it advisable to do that, or is it better to embrace, the handling of offers and from buyers asking for concessions to pay their brokers and that sort of thing, and negotiating it in the deal, etc. So the next big practice change, very impactful, is the mandatory written buyer agreements. So the first thing I always like to point out here is this is not mandatory buyer representation agreements or buyer agency agreements. These are just simply written agreements with buyers that you must have a buyer sign this written agreement if you're working with the buyer prior to touring the home. So those are the two triggers. I'll go into more detail on those in a second. But the purpose of this really isn't to establish agency or representation, but the purpose of this in the context of the settlement is just to make sure that the buyer is seeing, two very specific disclosures. One, that compensation is not fixed by law or rule or et cetera. And the second, that if you are charging compensation, that amount is specified in the agreement and is basically the bottom line. I'll let Monica speak to that, but that it's not that it's ascertainable, I think is the word that they're using. So it has to represent the maximum amount that you're going to be paid. It can't be open-ended, that it's this or something else. If something else is offered somewhere else that might be more, it needs to be basically the maximum amount that you're going to receive if they are to buy a home. Important.
So John, so it can't be like when you're saying open-ended, like it can't be whatever the listing broker offers or whatever the seller offers.
Right.
So.
Right, because I think we used to have that language in our old agreement, right? It's either it was blank, or if the listing broker offers more or whatever. I don't know the exact language, but something along those lines. But that is expressly prohibited under the settlement. So let's talk about sort of these triggers. And so, because the first question, of course, is, well, when do I have to do this? Is it for everything? Do I have to do this at open houses, et cetera? So it's the first trigger is working with the buyer. So it's participants who provide brokerage services to buyers. And so these are some of the options, like you're identifying potential properties, you're arranging for the buyer to tour property, you're negotiating on behalf of them, you're writing and presenting offers. That's different than somebody who's marketing their own services or talking to a buyer about one of their own listings. So in the circumstance where I'm at an open house, I'm running the open house for one of my listings, or I'm helping out somebody in my office for one of their listings. Well, I'm not working with the buyer at that point. At that point, I'm working on behalf of the seller, or at a minimum on behalf of the licensee who's working on behalf of the seller. So anybody who would walk into an open house in that scenario, I wouldn't have to have them sign that agreement. It's only when I cross that sort of line where now I'm going to when I'm going to work on their behalf, and I'm going to provide some service on their behalf, where I'm switching hats now, and I'm working. I could do it, by the way, as a facilitator, but I'm taking some action on their behalf. And so that's an important thing to mention. The facilitator aspect. Again, it's not compelling you to have to be their representative. You can act as a facilitator. So that's the first trigger. And the second is touring a home. So in the first trigger, well, gee, so if I'm going to set somebody up in one home to start getting emails of listing matches, do I have to have them sign a written agreement? No, you don't, until they tour a home. And so touring a home. So first, a home is the specific word, means a residential property consisting of not less than one nor more than 4 residential dwelling units. So this component is strictly applicable to single-family homes. Previously when we were talking about the compensation restriction, that's across the board. That's all property types. The buyer agreement is narrower in scope, strictly to residential property. And so touring a home is either when a buyer or the licensee physically enters the home. And so this includes when the licensee, perhaps the buyer's not there, but the licensee is walking around and doing a live tour with their phone, showing them the home. That's considered touring the home. And so you would be required to enter into a written agreement with them prior to doing that. Now, you could enter into a written agreement earlier in all cases where you're not sure, you're providing these services ahead of time, but you maybe haven't, toured a home. There's no reason you couldn't try to enter into a written agreement earlier, just, to sort of, I guess, take a more conservative approach to avoid any possibility of, well, gee, I didn't get them to sign something soon enough. But so this sort of represents, the final, the trigger. Like you can do it as early as you want, but no later than these 2 triggers. And so some things sort of related to this, and some questions we get or feedback is like, you hear about sort of these touring agreements, right? And we're gonna show our buyer agreements that in a few minutes, I guess, or we'll talk about them. And so they're a little more robust than simple touring agreements, but you don't have to use our forms, and you're free to create as lean a form as you want, provided you're really just covering these items of the disclosure about compensation not being fixed by law and what you're going to be paid, if anything, in the agreement, and then you can move ahead and be compliant with the settlement. Anything you want to add there, Monica?
I think we're good. We're just getting a lot of questions coming in.
You think, oh, I stopped. Oops, sorry about that.
That's
I didn't
okay.
mean to do that. I was trying to read the Q&A and I hit the wrong button. Let me, so you want to, probably we should answer a few of these now?
So why don't we do
no?
that then? Because my part will be short, but why don't we focus on the questions that you have right now, especially as they relate to MLS, and then
Okay.
I'll just give a few forms.
Okay, so here's one. Can we mention call for appointments for further details? Probably that has to do with compensation or whatever, right? So listen, we don't know the exact, we know you can't reference compensation but phrases that talk about your seller's willingness to negotiate, or my seller is open to negotiate, contact us, that's permissible.
Seller, I think, John, we had one this morning where someone asked us, seller is willing to entertain buyer's
Yeah.
request for concessions, I think was the wording.
Yeah. So there's that. So then let's talk a little bit about concessions because, some MLSs, they're talking about adding concession fields. Now, you are permitted to say in the remarks that seller will offer concessions, or you could even say seller will offer a blank amount for concessions, provided that amount isn't solely for the purpose of cooperative compensation. So that's prohibited. But Monica and I, we sort of talk about these things, and it's like, they have like these yes, no fields MLSs are adding that sellers, seller concessions, yes, no. And it's like we jokingly said, it's like there should be a maybe option, right? I mean, because how does a seller know when you're having that conversation with a seller, are you willing to offer concessions? It's like, well, it depends. I mean, I don't know. Like, what are you asking me? Like, it depends what the offer is, right? And so, you know, we've heard talk about like one of the key things you really should be doing with your seller. And I'm not a broker, so I mean, you folks know better than I do. But like one of the key things that they suggest you do early on is really work on like a net sheet with your seller, right? Because in the end, what matters more times than not to a seller is like what's their net going to be? How much are they going to make in a deal? Now there are other factors, obviously, time frame, and will the house appraise and all of those things, right? But by and large, one of the most important things is the net. And so evaluating whether or not they're going to accept an offer or be willing to make concessions depends on how it impacts the net, right? So if somebody's going to offer the full asking price, well, then maybe what they would offer for a concession would be less than if they're going to, offer X amount over the asking price and for concessions. And so, in one of the other feelings or things we heard recently is that so even disclosing an amount for concessions at the current asking price, potentially are you hurting your seller's ability to negotiate? In other words, are you saying basically to buyers, my seller is willing to give up at least X amount of dollars at this price, right? Versus a more broad statement that simply just says, hey, listen, my seller is willing to work with you or consider concessions, write it into your offer. I mean, that's really the point, right? It's like, what are you asking for? If your buyer wants concessions to, maybe even cover their broker's fee or whatever. Listen, this sort of broad statement that just says my seller is willing to negotiate, write it in your offer. It's going to come in on the offer. And then your seller is going to evaluate all the offers and they're going to see how it impacts their net and their timeline and all those things. And then they're going to obviously pick the offer that makes the most sense to them. So that's sort of this notion about what you can put in the MLS. So what language you put in there, that's sort of a work in progress for us a little bit on the MLS from an enforcement perspective. And that I guess we won't know we know the word compensation is wrong, but it's not to say that might be some other things that come up that we look at and we think, geez, that's probably not okay, right? So that's probably a veiled offer of compensation. So we're going to have to take that out. And so the question about an attachment, you cannot have so can you have an attachment instructing buyer agents to enter their fee request on the offer? I mean, I don't know if it has to be an attachment. I mean, you could actually say, is that an offer of compensation? If you're telling buyer agents to enter their fee request on the offer.
If you're just trying to give instructions, because the ultimate answer is just, it's going to be in the purchase and sales agreement that can be added there. But I think it's it sounds like what this person is asking is, can we give a hint? Like, especially if someone isn't paying attention to everything, can we say like, hint, hint, ask the seller for compensation in the purchase and sales agreement?
And so this next question sort of is another thing I guess we should talk about. Is broker-to-broker compensation outside MLS still allowed, or does it have to be seller to buyer's broker? And so the answer, technically it is allowed. But here's, so again, we're consuming all sorts of information on this. And so here's why brokers may not want to do broker-to-broker compensation. It's really about reducing your liability, right? Again, we talked earlier about sort of like this conspiracy to inflate, compensation, right? Or to it's the cost to the sellers. So, um, so, brokerages that continue to sort of collect the compensation, thereby charging a higher fee to a seller and then paying the cooperative broker, are they more at risk for sort of continuing that inflated compensation model versus collecting their fee, the seller negotiating, and then the seller, by way of concession or paying the fee, pays the buyer's broker directly, right? So now that's sort of been born out of the transaction where the buyer has made a request and the seller is agreeing to that as a term of the offer, and versus sort of the broker by default just collecting more and are artificially inflating compensation. Is that a fair sort of way to say that, Monica? You want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add to it because I'm going to be more of a doom and gloom monger. So
Please.
keep in mind with this whole thing, there are two parallel tracks. So there's the proposed settlement agreement between the National Association of Realtors, and that was negotiated with them and various plaintiffs' attorneys. And that includes the plaintiffs' attorneys who won a nearly $5.4 billion verdict in Missouri earlier this year. These plaintiffs' attorneys don't get paid until the settlement agreement is approved. Okay, so they're not going to be quite as nitpicky. All they care about, well, I shouldn't say all, I'm sure they have some consumer protection in mind, but their main goal is how do they get themselves and potential claimants paid. So that's one track, the settlement agreement negotiated. The other track is the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice, federal agency, they enforce antitrust laws. Some of you may have noticed that they just won a case against Google the other day. They're pursuing all kinds of major tech companies. So believe me, they're not shy of taking people on. So the Department of Justice has said in every court hearing or pleading in which they've intervened at all, they've said absolutely not. Buyers should pay cooperating brokers. Sellers should pay listing brokers. The only acceptable method of compensation is from a buyer asking a seller as part of an individually negotiated transaction for compensation. That's it. So what I would say, it really boils down to what level of risk that you and your brokerage are comfortable with. If you're the kind of person who drops 10 grand on a roulette table without batting an eyelash, by all means, continue to offer compensation to cooperating brokers. In the long run, you're really betting that, is the Department of Justice going to come after you? Or are they going to pursue people here? And that's really, practically speaking, what you're looking at. The settlement agreement does not prohibit, as John said, it does not prohibit compensation, listing broker to cooperating broker outside of MLS. However, in the long run, I think it'd be wiser to kind of start to transition to a newer model. And I ultimately think, usually I say this for the very end, but I ultimately think that, the main issue now, does it make sense that a buyer should pay a cooperating broker? Sure it does, but as we all know, the financing system really doesn't make that possible or easy. So until that's fixed, anyway, but that's where the Department of Justice's opinion is. But John, I have a question for you related to this. Is this an NAR ruling and not truly applicable to certain MLS organizations?
So I want to answer that one, then the next one as well. So of course, it's not applicable. It's applicable to certain MLSs, right? So if you're if you're a realtor-owned MLS, it's applicable. But by the way, every MLS still had to opt in. So realtors are covered without any opt-in. So realtors are protected under the settlement, provided you adhere to the practice changes. So individually, realtors are covered automatically as long as you adhere to the practice changes. MLSs have to opt in. So realtor MLSs opt in at no additional cost to the MLS, right? They don't have to pay in. They don't have to pony up. They're covered under the fee portion, but you still have to sign an affirmation as a realtor MLS to say that you will adhere to the practice changes. Non-realtor MLSs can also opt in to the settlement, but because they're non-realtor MLSs, they would have to just kick in extra money, they're not covered under the amount 480 million that NAR is paying for the settlement. And that sort of answers one of these other things that mentions, that MLS PIN is still allowing that, because MLS PIN is a non-realtor MLS, but also because they have their own separate lawsuit going on. And the Department of Justice, they actually don't even have preliminary. They reached a settlement, but it's not even preliminarily approved yet. And in their settlement, their shift was to say that, okay, it won't be broker to broker compensation. It's the seller that will put the offer of compensation in the MLS. So that's the seller making an offer, and it's at the current asking price. So if an offer comes in that's different than the asking price, then that the seller is not bound by that amount that they're offering through MLS PIN. The Department of Justice weighed in on that, by the way, and said that they don't like that. So, that's a separate thing, but they're not bound by this particular these practice changes. And one other question, and I want to just clear this up because I apologize if we've been confusing on this. Can we put in the fee we are charging to our sellers in the listing agreement? Sounds like you're saying compensation can't be mentioned at all. I apologize for that. You absolutely have to put the fee amount that you're charging the seller in your contract, right? The seller has to sign off on what they're paying you. You have to disclose to the seller what they're paying you, obviously. Beyond that, if you are, if you decide you want to continue to offer cooperative compensation, the seller has to sign off on that as well. You have to get the seller's sign off to say that they are agreeing that you are offering blank amount, like you used to in the old agreements.
One thing, John, if I could just back up quickly to your answer about MLS PIN.
Yep.
As you said, the Justice Department weighed in. Keep in mind, and this is no knock against MLS PIN. I mean, we're fortunate that we weren't sued, but they were unfortunate that they were sued directly for alleged antitrust violations. But they've been trying to, whenever you have a class action lawsuit, the settlement agreement has to be, it's not just approved by the parties, it has to be approved by the court, preliminary approval and final approval. So the National Association has preliminary approval for this settlement agreement we're implementing next week. No, anyway, but with MLS PIN, they've been trying to have the settlement agreement get preliminary approval by a judge for pretty close to a year now. They've gone through multiple negotiations, multiple versions of the settlement agreement. Each time the Department of Justice has said to the judge, do not approve this. It does not protect consumers adequately. And you just heard from John. I mean, they had some pretty dramatic changes proposed. At the time, it was very radical last fall. Still not approved by the judge. They decided to go implement some changes anyway. I'm sure hoping that it'll be approved eventually. But the Department of Justice has been very aggressive in their language and weighing in. So
I want to answer one more question. Then I really think we should jump into the forms, because I think a lot of these questions may be answered in sort of seeing what the new forms look like. How do you write things in? How does this, how do you use the new forms to sort of go work through this transaction? But the one I did want to mention, somebody asked about showing time. Can you mention in compensation there? The answer is no, it's not permitted. If showing time were to try to establish an offer of compensation, we would of course pull the feed of information to them. So it's not permissible. And I don't think showing time would want it, because I don't think they want the liability. They understand that any national platform offering compensation is going to be a target. So I don't think they're looking for that sort of heat, we shall say.
Sorry, John, before you move on, quick reminder for people. I just put it in the chat too, but if we see at least one person keeps raising a hand, we're not going to be able to unmute you. If you would just type your question into the Q&A, which you should see at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what kind of system you're using. Just type it there and we will do our best to get through everyone's questions.
Okay, Monica, I'm going to let you go ahead.
Okay. All righty, then you can put me on the hot seat, John.
Yep.
Okay, so I've given my opinion about cooperating brokers. All I know is that, like I said, there's two parallel tracks, the National Association of Realtors Settlement Agreement, and that was intended to be a global settlement agreement to get everyone off, basically all individual realtors off the hook because it wasn't just the verdict in Missouri that was nearly $5.4 billion. More than 20 of these lawsuits have been filed in different parts of the country, most by sellers, a few by buyers. So that's kind of the risk, the area of risk that we're looking at. Cooperating brokers, I'd say one of the questions that we just had earlier, then we'll take a look at some forms and give you that update. One of the questions that we had was, that John answered, was about, it doesn't mean we can't put any compensation in the listing contract. I would suggest shifting if you haven't already done so. Think in terms of not total comp, think in terms of what do you want to get paid for the services that you're offering. So negotiate your part as the listing broker, what's going to the listing brokerage. And then it'll be up to the cooperating broker and the buyer to negotiate if they're looking, if there is one, if they're looking for compensation. So make that shift about what services am I providing? How much am I charging? How much is the seller willing to pay? So some forms updates. So sorry, John, you just had a nice slide there that I was not talking to.
No, it's good. You're
So let me
sort of
do
talking
that
about it. So what I'm
now.
doing is I'm just queuing up the forms just to get them ready. There really wasn't much on the slide that you're addressing it
I
already.
appreciate that. And John, feel free to jump in if you have anything. I know I sort of barge in when you're talking, so you do the same.
No, this is your turn. It's not my turn to, so
No, you
yeah.
can
So you're going to
heckle
talk
me.
about the forms, I guess, and that we've distributed the
Yes.
forms, et cetera. So go ahead.
Okay, so the forms, probably the biggest question of the last few days and this week is, where are the forms? Can I access them? Okay, so hopefully most of you have seen by now, forms, watermark samples. These are both MLS forms and Rhode Island Association of Realtors forms. If you haven't seen that, we can drop that. I can drop that link in the chat, but it's on the RIRealtors.org page. Anyway, so the real issue is, when are these forms going live? All right, as we probably told you before, you're probably sick of hearing, but I'll say it again. All the forms were sent to all of the forms vendors on the same day. So that's whether it's .loop, ZipLogix, Transaction Desk, some of the other ones that we support as well. They all update at different times. So .loop has now all the MLS and RIR forms, except for John, the MLS data form. Those aren't.
Yeah. So the data forms, we sort of we're a little behind the eight ball on that. We were so focusing on the contracts because of the language that with the data forms, really all we're doing is removing two fields: the cooperating compensation or the compensation to cooperating brokers field, and the compensation comments. So we do have revised forms; those have been circulated, but it's a data form, so you can use the old one and scratch those out for now if you want, or just don't fill them in. I don't know how many people are even still using those forms, or I guess you must, some probably fill it out and have the seller sign off on it, but you would just, scratch those fields out till the new forms come out.
So thanks, John. And so everything else is live in .loop, RIR forms, MLS forms. So there's a listing contracts, purchase and sales agreements, buyer rep, and just buyer contracts, and some rental forms as well. Those are live there. Transaction Desk, only the MLS forms have been updated as of this morning. My colleague has been badgering them about the status of when the RIR forms will be available. The person who actually designs the forms completed her work last week. I understand that now it's going through some kind of quality control before they go live. So at this point, we're hoping that they'll be available this week as live forms. The others have not received responses on following up with them, but we don't know when they'll go live. Okay, so that's what's going on with those. And I know it's frustrating because you'd like to have them live sooner, but at least as far as training purposes and getting familiar with them, at least those are now available too. And okay, so one thing to make sure, if you're looking for the forms, we've been getting some calls about people who've gotten the new forms but weren't really aware of it. What you want to look for, the date of revision is going to be 6/24. So that will be in the bottom right-hand corner of any form that's been updated, that revision date, because that's when they were approved here and then sent to the forms vendors back in June. Okay, so that'll tell you. If you have any questions about it, certainly contact either one of us about the forms. Okay, then we have one question that keeps coming up is, and we'll take a look at a couple of individual forms as a recap. Some people have said, well, what if I want to use my own form? Can I do that? So what I would say to any of the forms that are contracts, you can always use your own forms, assuming that your principal broker is willing to go along with that. But any company can adopt its own forms. What I would say though is you want to make sure that they comply with the provisions of the NAR Settlement Agreement. And there's quite a specific list there. If you have questions about, and actually most of those, you're going to see all of those changes in the RIAR and MLS forms, because those do comply with what's in the settlement agreement. Make sure that if you're working with an attorney or someone that person is familiar with antitrust and the specifics of the settlement agreement. Okay, moving along. So free to use your own forms. Let's take a look at a couple of these. So here's the whole list that John has shown you. These are the Rhode Island Association of Realtors forms. And we actually, it looks longer than it might be. I mean, there are 8 different versions of the purchase and sales agreement. So those changes are really going to be the same throughout. For the most part, there were major changes made to the buyer representation agreement several months ago. And so really, I don't think we even need to take a look at that right now, even that one, John, because it's the exclusive buyer rep agreement. There's really only one more change. The change in that, and you'll see that theme in most of these forms changes, is to eliminate any reference to compensation to cooperating brokers.
Yeah, I think the only thing that we could maybe talk about with the buyer agreement is that you see there's sort of an on the bottom, so it's an exclusive buyer representation agreement, but remember earlier we talked about you can have an agreement and just act as a facilitator. So one of your new forms on the bottom of the list are these transaction facilitator, where you don't want to establish that you're their representative, but you're going to act in a facilitator capacity. So we have 2 different forms for that. One's an exclusive and one is a non-exclusive.
Yep,
And then we have the MLS forms, right? Which again, it looks like a bigger list because we have a lot of, we have exclusive right to sell in various versions. But as you said with the other ones, the changes are consistently reflected. It's the same change in all the multiple forms. So maybe I should bring up a form.
Sure.
Do you want to start with the listing agreement? Maybe?
Sure, why not?
That seems like a good logical place to start. So here's the exclusive right to sell. Get zoomed in. Hopefully everybody can see this. And so the change really starts in section 6 here, right?
Yep. Yeah, so one of the changes is this is actually feedback we'd heard from a number of realtors, the preference of not calling something a commission, but calling it a professional services fee. So you'll see that theme throughout the forms. It's not that commission's a dirty word or anything like that, but I think we'll be seeing more of, commission kind of tends to indicate a percentage. I think we'll be seeing more people looking at might be dollar amounts or creative ways of charging compensation. One thing that you'll see in here, and this would be true if you decide to create your own forms or have an attorney do that for you, you'll see where it says compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. So when you're talking about compensation, negotiating compensation, that's required by the settlement agreement. Okay.
And that's on both sides. So that's when we were talking about the buyer agreement, and sort of like the 2 clauses. This is one clause that you need to get the buyer to sign off on, and then the other is your compensation amount.
Yep.
So exactly. It's a very simple, sort of like if you want bare minimum and what you need to have a buyer sign, it's a very simple couple of sentences, right? This and then whatever you're going to be paid.
I do know that some people, we have had some questions about why does this say gross sales price? That isn't a change, but the default is gross because one of the things you'll see that MLS rules are changing as well to go along with these changes. So in MLS, it kind of defines, what's a net, what you want to do is if you are going to charge on the net, you want to make sure and define that someplace. What do you consider net? Because everyone is sure that his or her definition is correct. And you would be surprised at some of the calls that MLS and then I separately receive.
Yeah. And so to the extent that we had that defined in MLS, it was only because it was relevant as far as the offer of cooperative compensation, right? So that if you were telling somebody you're going to pay them on the net, Well, then the cooperating broker needed to know what the heck the net was, and so it was very narrowly defined as what that was. Now the offer is going away, so the definition of net from the MLS also goes away because it's just not relevant. And so, yeah. So as Monica said, this really isn't a change. But if for some reason your seller is paying you only on the net, then you just need to define that.
Yeah, like what are you deducting? Or do you deduct repairs from the net, or anything like that? So
Build outs, whatever, right? New construction, build outs.
Exactly. If we could scroll down to number 6, please.
Number 6.
7. Oh. Okay. Yeah.
So obviously the big change you said, I was reading some questions, but the big change here is the section, any reference to cooperative compensation has been removed, right? So that doesn't exist anymore on the listing agreement.
Exactly. Yeah. And so anything extra that you want to put in there in section 7, whether some people have asked about things like variable rate compensation, the net, anything like that, that's the extra room for you to talk about how you want to be charged. What is the seller going to pay you? And then the other fees, which is number 8, you can also see on your screen that has that same disclaimer: compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. And then it also gives a nudge. And we know, as John said before, we know that some of this is kind of repetition, but the closer we get, the closer we get to August 14th. I know that it's been a lot to digest, so we just want to kind of do some quick reminders to make sure that everyone has it and is good shape. So in this one, this is basically a prompt. So you're saying to the seller, rather than putting in compensation to a cooperating broker in this listing contract, and having it go the seller paying you, then you pay a cooperating broker. This is kind of that shift that John was talking about before, where you're nudging the cooperating broker to say, you're nudging the seller to say, hey, don't be surprised when you get a purchase and sales agreement. The buyer may be asking you for concessions. They might be asking you to compensate the broker they're working with, the cooperating broker, contribute to closing costs or anything like that. So this is a good jumping off point for you to have that discussion with the seller. They don't have to commit to any specific amount up front, but just to say, just to set expectations. Don't be surprised if this happens. So,
right.
John, anything you wanted to add? Or?
That's exactly what that's for. So depending on how you handle, what you're putting in this line item up here in number 6, right, or whatever you're doing here, if your intent is to solely collect your compensation as the listing broker and not, in this new world, not collect, not even worry about cooperative compensation, then you really need to have this conversation with the seller that's going to say, look, it's very likely in the course of the transaction that a buyer is going to ask for some sort of concession, because they're unable to pay their broker directly. So you really need to set that expectation that, it's probably likely that it will come up in the course of the transaction.
Yeah, and also keep in mind with the seller, that's the right way to have that conversation with the seller, what John just said. The wrong way to do it, and this is something that the Department of Justice and also plaintiffs' attorneys got involved with, is you don't want to say, well, if you don't offer compensation to a cooperating broker, no one will show your house. No one will buy your house. Or you have to offer at least a minimum of X amount or X percentage or something like that. If you even, that wasn't something people should have been doing before, but unfortunately found out that a lot across the country were doing that. So just focus on the buyer. Some buyers are not going to be able to, they don't have a way to finance this. So until that system is fixed, that's why they're asking you to compensate.
Yeah. So, yeah. I'm sure we'll get into this more as we work through questions, because that's a lot of what, a lot of the questions are like, look, how do we sort of hold on to the old way, or how do we transition into the new way? And what if I want to be able to offer something, or what if my seller is willing to pay? How do we write that up? How do we express that? And so, certainly as Monica said, you could have the conversation with your seller that they're willing to pay. It doesn't have to be advertised, but it's a conversation so that as the offers come in, and again, you have your net sheet and they can see how all of these things because it is going to be it's going to depend on the price, right? The offer price in the end, probably. So I think it's hard
Right.
for a seller. I know I just sold my home recently, and if my broker had asked me what I'd be willing to pay, I couldn't tell you that. I don't no idea. It depends on what we're looking at. So it's
Right.
so it's more about the conversation, maybe less about the actual amount until the offers start coming in. But it's expressing in the listing your seller's willingness to, which I
Yes.
think it's probably an expectation on the buy side anyway, that of course your seller is willing to negotiate, right? Most are. It's probably, the maybe it's more important to put in there seller not willing to negotiate in there, and that's, and the seller doesn't even know. Maybe they think they're not willing to, hey, I'm not, whatever, I've been reading the headlines, I'm not willing to pay the buyer broker, da 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 da. Well, until they get an offer that comes in that's, 60,000 or whatever thousand, however much more over asking price. And then they realize, oh, well, okay, I guess then, my net is higher than what it's going to be. So I don't really, fine, so it, there's a lot of conversation that's going to have to happen around this. And I think it's hard to just sort of out the gate, just have this set amount that the seller thinks that they're gonna pay. But
Yeah, it's definitely a shift. John, if we could do two more things, then I'm ready
yeah,
for questions too.
yeah,
We could take a quick look at the purchase and sales agreement.
right. Because that's the next part of this. It's like, okay, so we've talked about this thing and there's concessions or whatever, or maybe I get a phone call and somebody asks, hey, is your seller willing to, are they open to paying or whatever? And then you say, yes, put it in your offer, or let's put it in the purchase and sales. Like, where does that go from there? So you've had the conversation. Now you need to get some sort of agreement in writing to solidify that. So let me pull up the PNS agreement here. I'm stalling as I try
That's
to.
okay. You know what? I'll mention the other quick thing while you're looking. So some of you, and actually I know John, you received one of these too. I just received a call from a realtor this morning who said that he and some of his neighbors had all gotten postcards basically saying, did you sell a house between these years and those years? If so, you might be entitled to compensation. Those postcards will be going out. Now, those were for a different settlement agreement because some of the national real estate corporations were individually sued before and they negotiated their own settlement agreements. So most of those are leftovers from that. But sometime, we don't know the date yet, but sometime after August 17th, the plaintiff's attorneys and a claims administrator will be sending out postcards to any seller who would potentially be covered by the settlement agreement. And those postcards, if you get them, John can share his experience if he wishes, but if you get them, basically, you don't really want to answer questions about the settlement agreement. Each person who gets a postcard will have an individual QR code, and it will have contact information. So to find out, are they eligible? How much they might potentially be entitled to, what forms they have to fill out, etc.
So I
So
apologize.
that's
My
okay.
Adobe crashed, and for some reason Adobe isn't even running. So I had to quickly pivot and figure out how to open with Edge here. So
You were
here we
very
go.
nimble, John. Good job.
Sorry. Well,
So,
yeah, it worked. It worked out. So okay. So
so section 18, please.
okay. Sorry if I'm going to give you all motion sickness here. Here we go.
Oh, make it stop. No, anyway. Yeah, so this one, this is the professional services fee. This is what we were talking about before, that basically that even the Department of Justice allows this as as a method, even a recommended method, that a buyer can ask the seller to pay the cooperating broker some or all of the compensation, so that if the buyer is not able to pay out of pocket. So this is where you'd put this in. You put in a dollar amount, a percentage, etc. Again, you'll see in here under the second checkbox under A says percentage of the gross sales price. Some people were asking about that. Why is it gross? Why isn't it net? And that's what we were talking about before the MLS rules going away. That you really want to clearly spell out, if a buyer wanted to do that, really clearly spell out what they think net is, or if the seller is counter offering, what is deducted in net, because people really have a right to have a very clear understanding of what they're getting paid. In some ways, and it's entirely up to you and your broker, but it might be easier to pivot to dollar amounts. Now, that's your call, but then you're just having a set amount and not having to do these calculations about, someone changed a window sash. And is that something that's going to be deducted from the compensation overall? You'll see in B here that the buyer will or will not compensate the cooperating broker according to a separate contract. The reason that that's there, that's actually part of the Realtor Code of Ethics that or no, I apologize, that's a different one. For B, that is basically to help you educate lenders. This is a lot of lenders and mortgage brokers are going through the same learning curves that we all are. And this is just to kind of remind them, because we've gotten some feedback from some closing attorneys that have seen closings delayed because they didn't realize that there was a buyer contract in place. So this is just to kind of nudge everyone to at least say, like, wait, what's this about? Where's this fee coming from? And then under C, that's the one that's actually part of the Realtor Code of Ethics. Cooperating broker will or will not receive compensation from more than one party. That has been required by the Code of Ethics. And then finally, D, if someone asks you, here's how to explain the legal mumbo jumbo. D says the cooperating broker is intended to be a third-party beneficiary of this agreement. This doesn't put you as a cooperating broker on the hook. They're not party to the contract. What it does say is you don't want to have the buyer and seller to get to the closing table and say, I really don't feel like paying this after all. So this actually makes this a term of the contract that protects the cooperating broker as someone who is entitled to get compensation out of this. So that is for your protection, and you don't want to cross that one out. Okay, so I think I'm done going on, unless John, did you have any comments about this or questions?
So here's a question specifically. In Section 18, how would you document listing agent compensation to co-broker?
In this one, I would not. This is really geared towards the seller paying the cooperating broker. So
yeah, it's not coming from the broker. It's not broker to broker.
Right.
It's seller to broker. Right. So broker to broker, really, you would have to do that by your own sort of agreement. If you're, I suppose, right. We don't have an agreement for broker to broker compensation, obviously, largely because of the settlement. And so any brokers would have to come up with their own sort of form if they've decided, right. If they felt so inclined, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a form, but it's actually being removed from the platforms. Part of it is we're not allowed to kind of enable listing broker to cooperating broker compensation as part of this agreement. So that's why that particular form is going away.
So there's an existing form for that people, I suppose, continue to use if they wanted that. We could stop them, but we're pulling it down though, right? I mean, it's not our form. I mean,
yeah, because one thing I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One thing I did want to mention before about when I was talking about the Department of Justice. I know I even describe myself as a gloom and doom monger, but I don't think we can overemphasize the power and interest of the Department of Justice. So you think of the California Association of Realtors, just barely a month ago, was all set to send all of its new forms to the vendors. Well, the Department of Justice sent them an inquiry, and they didn't like any of the California forms because they included compensation to cooperating brokers. So paid by a listing broker compensating a cooperating broker. So they had to redo all their forms because they really didn't want to be investigated by the Department of Justice. So that's what I'm saying is if you're trying to develop your own forms to kind of keep to the old ways of listing brokers offering compensation to cooperating brokers, keep that in mind. I mean, California certainly has deeper pockets than the rest of us do. And that didn't stop the Justice Department from trying to make an example out of them. I'm not saying it's easy. I know this is a big shift for a lot of people, but just saying that, keep in mind, separate from the settlement agreement, the Department of Justice has not been shy about getting involved. Okay, when I do more questions, John.
Yeah, let's dig in. So I have a listing going live on August 15th. Well, I now have to update all forms. I mean, there is a provision right now, if you're using the existing listing agreement, that says that you'll be offering compensation through the MLS. So you won't be doing that effective the 15th. So you really need you do need some sort of modification. Now, you can do that in a number of different ways, right? One of the forms we came up with, we didn't show it, but it was on the list, is an amendment form that's new so that you can amend any provision in the listing agreement. I mean, you could always do that using some, whatever. You could draft your own amendment and sign it, but we've had people ask us frequently that, gee, do you have, or it would be nice to have an actual amendment form. So the amendment form just is consistent with the sections in the exclusive listing agreement, as far as headers. So you could use that, or you could simply modify, I guess, the actual form you have and do strike throughs and initial that, I guess, or you could sign a whole new listing agreement, I guess, if you wanted to do that. I mean, you have options.
And then the question, will there be any approved forms that we should use to establish a buyer and seller fee? Yeah, that was in the purchase and sales agreement that we just showed. For any of you who use a letter of intent, that same wording is in there too, if you do the two-step process. So that would be the area to negotiate that compensation. You can certainly raise it earlier. We ask the list, if you're a cooperating broker, ask the listing broker, do you know if the seller would be willing to entertain compensating a cooperating broker, but really it's going to be the purchase and sales agreement.
So there's a question about, can this organization go after agents who offer compensation on their individual platforms? I'm not sure which organization. Sure. MLS will certainly, if there are individuals offering compensation, MLS will certainly investigate to see if those individuals are getting data feeds from the MLS, and then we would take appropriate action that way. Obviously we can't shut sites down, but we would certainly turn off any data feeds to those sites.
And so could the Department of Justice do something? Yes.
Sure.
They could. They might want to make examples out of people.
And then not just the Department of Justice, but those lawyers, right? That yes. That are just looking to make, and by the way, we're not just talking about like, class action, nationwide lawsuits or whatever. I mean, it could just very well be that there's some, copycat right here in Rhode Island who's just going to keep an eye on this market and see if any brokers in this area are continuing the model, and they may just go after that brokerage individually on behalf of some Rhode Island consumers. So, while this settlement's national, it doesn't mean there's not exposure on a smaller level. And so it kind of goes back to what Monica said about risk tolerance. And we're not just talking about the DOJ. The risk, if the DOJ seeing what somebody in Rhode Island is doing maybe is lower than a local ambulance chaser, who sees, who's got their eye on an opportunity here in the state is. So.
Yeah, it could be like the dog bite, slip and fall plaintiffs' attorneys who get paid on a contingency. And the other thing, keep in mind, is just that sellers can choose to opt out of the settlement agreement. So, some really huge sellers who have a lot of money might decide that they don't want to be part of the settlement agreement and they'll just pursue something on their own. But because they're not going to get a huge amount of recovery from this,
right?
With all
50 cents, whatever they get. If the buyer signs a buyer broker agreement and says they won't pay, then does that mean buyer's agent technically can't accept the co-broke fee if offered?
They have some kind of compensation.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what the agreement says. But in other words, if I guess you have a buyer agreement and the buyer has agreed to pay you X, and now they're saying, I'm not going to pay. Are you prohibited from collecting that fee somewhere else? You're supposed to disclose and you're working on the buyer's fiduciary. And so you're supposed to tell the buyer what you're going to be paid and that they're the source of that. But now they're reneging on their contract with you. And so does that mean you could be free to collect compensation? The settlement doesn't contemplate that really, but yeah. I don't know.
I guess I'm trying to think how you would, like the mechanism to do that, I think would be challenging. But keep in mind, like sometimes, even though we're thinking more on the buy side, like what if I don't get paid? What if the buyer doesn't want to pay me? But people have dealt with that on the listing side. I mean, think in times where you've had sellers who either their cash flow's limited, or maybe it's not technically a short sale that requires bank approval, but they're not gonna have enough money in the net proceeds to pay you. You might have to chase them for compensation. I mean, hopefully these are rare occurrences, but the fact is, that does happen where consumers breach contracts. So,
Yeah, I mean, obviously on the buy side, it's going to be certainly challenging because, let's face it, we know a lot of buyers are just trying to get all their money together just for the down payment, right? And so they, likely don't have that extra to pay the agent directly. And so a real world, not to, now I'm going to be the doom and gloomer, but a real world scenario that may happen is that you have an agreement with your buyer and they find that home, that their dream home, and there's not compensation offered, and the seller is not willing to offer a concession. So now you're sitting at the table with your buyer saying, the buyer's like, you're saying that, well, Mr. Buyer, you've agreed to pay me X, and they're not willing to cover that. So, and the buyer's like, gee, I really want that home, and you're like, I really want to get paid, and it's sort of the game of chicken where you're looking at each other, decide who's gonna give first. Like, as a broker, do you just say, well, gee, I really want to get you in that home, and you're gonna forfeit your fee? That doesn't seem reasonable, right? And for the buyer to say, well, geez, I want to get into that home, I know I agreed, but you're keeping me from realizing my dream. It's a real scenario, and I don't know, Monica. I mean, I don't think
no,
we have
I've
any real
gotten
pearls of
some.
wisdom to offer there, right? I mean, what do you?
No, I mean, I've definitely had some conversations like that with people recently. That's why I say ultimately the solution's got to be a finance solution, like major changes at the national level. And,
Right.
even VA was originally, you might remember VA was taking a wait and see approach about compensation. Good lobbying on the part of the National Association of Realtors got them to change. So I'm hoping that later on this year, because you don't want to have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I mean, it would look terrible for one of the unintended consequences of all this to have certain buyers who just, probably some of the buyers that need representation the most,
Right.
not being able to access it.
Right.
I've heard a couple of people have made reference to the idea, not today, but I've heard people make reference to the idea of like, should we have a nonprofit? Should we have, pro bono type situation to help some of those marginalized buyers? Who knows? But anyway, there are definitely some practical questions.
Okay, so we've got lots of questions. Maybe we try to lightning round. Our current
Okay.
listings,
In other
our
words, help
current,
me talk less.
yeah, no, I mean, listen, our current
Shorter.
our current listings required to be updated somehow, some way. The answer is, well, yes. I mean, as far as the listings themselves, the fields, the compensation fields will be removed, so you don't have to do anything to your listing as it appears in the MLS. That'll be taken care of automatically. So on the morning, as of midnight, I guess, August 13th, boom, we flip the switch, those fields are gone. Contractually, like we mentioned earlier, if you have an agreement that says you're offering compensation through the MLS, so it seems that you'd need to get some sort of amendment with your seller.
Mhm. Yep, got
Uh,
that.
to clarify, if you were the listing agent, you do not have to have them sign anything when they ask to see your property. Correct. This goes back to the buyer agreement. Is this buyer agreement an NAR rule or law? It's a rule of the settlement, right? It's a condition of the settlement is what it is. So it's not a rule. Well,
Right.
I mean, it technically is an MLS rule now because the NAR agreed to it in the settlement, and so they actually did make a change, and so that change is actually now in our rules and regulations.
Yep.
Oh, crud. No, I didn't close them. Okay. Can the commission received be less than the amount stated in the initial agreement?
Yes, and that's where you'd use, John mentioned some of the amendment forms. So there is now an amendment to buyer representation agreement. And so you would use that, and if you're willing to accept a different amount, you just amend that, the contract with the buyer.
Can I change my buyer agent contract commission if the seller is offering more or less? Yeah. So Monica just addressed the offering less. So let's talk about the offering more scenario and how that's supposed to play out, right? Because the you know they've agreed to pay you X, but there's more on the table being offered. Now, the consumer sort of federation-y folks would say that there needs to be a conversation with the buyer that, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you agreed to pay me X here. This particular company is offering Y, or the seller is offering Y, or whatever. There's an offer of Y on the table that's blank more than we agreed to. How would you like to handle this? Would you like the price, the asking price to go down by this amount? Would you like this amount, Mr. Mrs. and Mrs. Buyer? Would you like the proceeds go to you? Or I guess option C is, would you like me as the buyer representative to get that amount as a tip or whatever, right? I guess. Now, some suggest that maybe you shouldn't even offer the third option. You should let them sort of, initiate that conversation, but would they? Who knows? And then you're not prohibited from offering that. But there are really three options, right? And you'd have to have that conversation with the buyer, and then the buyer would have to sign off. If they do agree to let you collect more, they would have to amend the agreement.
Yep. What I would suggest is if you're looking to increase the amount you're getting paid, it shouldn't just be the seller's offering more. It should be, are you offering different services? And ideally it would be initiated by the buyer, but why did the value of your services suddenly go up? Because every amount, whatever the seller is paying, ultimately that's built into the cost of the house. So you just want to make sure that you're not going to the old ways of just kind of whatever the listing broker offers, you're happy to take. So
I'm not going to name the names in this one, but there's sort of a question about these other sites that are kind of popping up to sort of be, replacements or alternatives, and but that they're not accurate in the way that the MLS are, and that's a valid point, well taken. I mean, one of the big values to the MLS is it is the rules and regulations. It's the structure. It's the requirement that listings be updated in a timely fashion. It's the requirement that you have exclusive agreements when listing a home in the MLS. And so I probably sound like a broken record here, but if you've ever tried to list or sell something on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, it's a crapshoot. There are no rules per se. I mean, I guess there are some sort of rules, and then they'll pull your ad, right? But there's not that quality control that you get from an MLS. And so that these other sites that are popping up likely don't have that level of, they're not really interested in the quality control, right? They're looking to sort of get in there and, hey, we'll just kind of create this service. And without that quality, are they going to be a useful source to real estate professionals or to consumers? Probably not, but time will tell.
and also, like, if you ever look at something is showing, say, as pending in statewide MLS, and then your client or you look at another site and something's showing as active, how will your client react when you find out that this house they're getting all excited about is already under contract with someone else? So that's it. Like, what's the value of good data?
If they call the listing agent directly, do you need to have them sign something? So it's hard to know the context in which, if you're a licensee working with the buyer and they decide to go direct. I mean, technically it's prior to the buyer touring the home, right? Doesn't say you have to be there with them. So let's say you're working with the buyer, they go direct to see the property. Technically you're working with a buyer and the buyer is touring a home. So I would argue that you probably do need to have them sign something.
Well, I would say that with the exclusive buyer representation agreement and the exclusive transaction facilitator agreement, it's similar to an exclusive right to sell. So if you think of an exclusive right to sell listing agreement, if a seller goes off and they find out that their tenant or their next door neighbor is interested in buying the property, if it happens during the term of your listing, they owe you compensation. If you want to agree to something else, you can. So same thing with the buyer. When you're in an exclusive contract, unless you modify it in some way, it's if the buyer finds the property on their own, if they stop by an open house after you've shown them like 20 homes and that one day they just spontaneously stop by an open house, yeah, if they want to buy that property, they're going to owe you money. So the thing you want to just really take good care is, I know that in the past, it's been kind of a lot of people doing that hood of the car first meeting of a buyer. Think of it as a counseling session, the way that a listing broker as a listing broker you would do with a seller. Like really sitting down, you're not just working with them. And believe me, I understand it will take, even though John and I aren't practitioners, we understand it'll take some time to have that shift for consumers too, to understand what it is that you're doing. They're not just bopping around from place to place. They're looking for a trusted advisor to help them get through this. So
Okay. Wow. These questions are piling up. Here I thought, oh, we're probably going to end early, and well, we're creeping up on time. So, so this does not apply to a 6-unit. I don't even know how to say that. What is that word? Habitational. Habitation? Yeah, that's a new one on me. It does not. So as far as if by this we mean the buyer agreement, that it's only for residential or single family homes. So that answers this one. And the one that says further down, can we presume this is only for 1, 2, and 3, 4 families? Correct. So that's a 2 for 1 right there. Yeah, is a realtor who has been sending auto emails to a client for months or years, are you now obliged to enter into a representative agreement with that long-term prospect? If all you've been doing is sending them auto emails, the answer is no. It's not until again that second trigger of touring a home. Once they go to tour a home, then yes, you would have to enter into an agreement. Now, again, maybe you want to enter into this. You could certainly enter into an agreement earlier if you choose to, just to sort of solidify your position, I guess, with those folks, but you don't have to.
Yes. And John, actually, before we move on to the next one on screen, we had one realtor who was so organized that she sent us questions in advance. So I would like to give her a shot since she was that organized. So I'm just going to read it, and hopefully she's still listening, but if not, this is being recorded. So here are the questions. So is a cooperating broker required to show proof of a buyer contract with the listing broker at any point in the transaction?
No. So that's a great question. So let's just spin it. Is a listing broker obligated to show a cooperating broker their exclusive right to sell listing agreement? No. The answer is no. So there is no burden on the listing broker to verify that a buyer agreement has been executed. That's not your burden. That's our burden as the MLS. So if a broker calls to show a property, you are obligated to cooperate, under rules and the code of ethics. So you need to let them into the property. If you suspect that they may not have an exclusive buyer agreement, then you would just pick up the phone or you could send us, an anonymous snitch to the MLS and let us know, and we would investigate. Likewise, as we would with a listing, where if you suspect that a broker who has a listing in the MLS doesn't have a contract, we would investigate it in the same manner.
And related to that, is a cooperating broker required to show a copy of their contract to the listing broker?
Isn't that what the same question? Didn't we just answer that question?
A slight variation on it.
Well, the answer is still no, right? You're
one
not
is
required.
proof. I know, I'm giving you an easy one.
What are you?
No, one is just the buyer's agent have to show the proof, and the other is can the listing broker demand it. So I guess that is two sides of the same question.
Yeah. The listing broker has no rights there. And frankly, it's not the listing broker's problem. It's not like, I guess, you could speak better to this, but we're not talking about mandatory like state disclosure forms or whatever. Right. It's not your burden as the listing broker. Frankly, you've got enough to worry about without that having to be your concern,
Yes. I think I've got 2 more from this super organized realtor. So one of them is, can the listing broker spell out the terms of a variable rate of compensation, depending on whether the person has one side or 2 sides of the transaction?
Yeah. So, again, you have to spell that out, right? The answer is you have to. So if you're with the listing form that we had in there, there's a few ways to skin the cat, right? But if your intention is to, on the top part, collect your fee as the listing broker, and then there's a separate fee, for the buyer broker, and then that also applies to you if you happen to bring the buyer. So then there's sort of like, I guess that's technically a dual rate where you're paid one if they go direct. Well, no, I guess that's really a buyer. I guess that's sort of a representation issue. I guess the answer is Yeah, well, I don't remember the question now, but yeah, you would have to disclose it. You'd have to get them to sign off. Well, you don't have to
Variable.
disclose it, but you have to, of course, you are permitted to do that, and you would have to have that in the contract. The seller would have to sign off on it. I mean, that, you know, it's about transparency to the seller, so you need to make the seller aware of that.
And yeah, and that's still considered a specific amount. What you want to, I mean, I think the justification for a possible justification would be, are you doing more work? Performing more services depending on whether there's a cooperating broker or whether there's not. But that's really up to you and the seller to negotiate. But you don't want to have it just open-ended. And even though it's relatively unusual in my experience for a buyer to be paying the listing broker, I mean, it's certainly possible. So you definitely want to have, you don't want to have like some floating compensation. It needs to be, if I perform these services, it's this. If I perform those services too, then it's that amount, percentage amount, whatever.
All right, here's one. So if a buyer agent is away and another agent from the office is helping out and does a showing with that, the previous agent's buyer, does a different form have to be signed? I mean, the settlement agreement doesn't say anything really to that extent. I mean, I guess it's at the broker level, right? So if it's signed off at the brokerage, isn't one form enough, Monica? Or we really don't know, I guess, right? It doesn't, the settlement doesn't explicitly address that scenario. I mean, in other words,
Settlement, yeah, you're right, the
I mean,
settlement doesn't address it, but, oh, go ahead, John.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm really interrupting, I apologize.
No, it's good. Go ahead.
But no, so with it, so what you want to do, and similar to what people should be doing with the listing contract up front, is if you think, I mean, at some point, who knows, you might be, on vacation, you might have something going on. Are there other people, if you're part of a team, or or even an informal team, are there other people in the office whom you would expect potentially to help your client? So with something like that, you could address it on the mandatory real estate relationship disclosure, include like who else might potentially be helping that person in the brokerage. And then also in the contract, are there more people in the office who might be filling in? So yeah, so if you've already addressed that up front, you wouldn't necessarily need a separate anything new at that point. But if you didn't address it up front, then yes.
So here's a concession about concession. Oh my God, I'm getting woozy. I always get woozy by the end of these.
We're warning people, that's why.
I know concessions are not commissions. How could it be improper? So the settlement specifically, so there's a prohibition about there's a prohibition against compensation being offered in the MLS or being in the MLS anywhere. But then they go on to say that it's okay for concessions to appear. So for the avoidance of doubt or whatever, they wanted to make a point of making clear that it's still okay to offer concessions through the MLS. However, as long as the caveat is, as long as the concessions aren't solely to pay for compensation. So what they recognize is that concessions are offered through the MLS, seller to pay, X amount in closing costs or whatever it is. What they don't want is the open door just to say, well, you can offer concessions, and then people just swap the word concession for commission, and then life goes on. So that's what that's what that's all about.
Yeah, and just to add, the Department of Justice isn't stupid, so they can figure it out. And one large MLS actually was doing that as an experiment. Now just changed their mind. And what they're finding is when they had a concession field, one of their members did kind of a little informal study, and it looked like all the percentages put in the concession field were pretty much the same kind of percentages that people were doing for compensation to cooperating broker. So that's why we're not going there. And that MLS has since changed its mind about how they're doing that.
Do referral fees need to be disclosed on the listing sales agreement? So this is a good one that's sort of come up, right, Monica, with referral fees, because I don't know the answer. I mean, how do referral fees play in this whole thing?
I think that's $1 million question, because nothing in the settlement agreement addresses it. Nothing from the National Association of Realtors guidance at this point addresses it. But I think I'd certainly consider erring on the side of oh, I hate buzzwords, but I'm going to use one. Transparency. I know people need to understand who's paying what. Who's in charge, who is paying this cost? Why is it there? How much is it? So I would certainly think it's a wise idea. It's up to each brokerage how you want to handle that, but couldn't hurt.
somebody asked how the commercial listing form is still going to have the section about cooperative compensation. The answer is no. As I mentioned, the ban on compensation applies to all property types. So we've taken it out of every version of our exclusive listing agreement for every property type. I'm just scrolling through these quickly now. I'm trying to sort of give to start at the top. I'm like, I have to give love to the bottom of the list. So I'm trying to work through here because we still have a lot. So if you see anything, Monica, you want to just
okay, yeah, I'll
out.
scroll through this as well. Okay, we did have a question, probably a better financing question, but is the commission paid to a cooperating broker ever appear in the buyer's side of the closing statement? That's going to be a question for a lender or mortgage broker because, for the most part, conventional financing, we've had some mortgage brokers do some of these presentations before through RIAR, and most have said, no, there isn't any kind of conventional financing that allows that. But, I'm not a mortgage broker, neither is John. So I would suggest anything like that. When you're first working with a buyer, if you don't already do this, and I suspect many of you do, you want to have a conversation, especially now, as early as possible, even before the buyer's making an offer or something, making a purchase and sales agreement. Because like I said, you're kind of educating mortgage brokers and lenders too. And you want to just say like, hey, how's this all going to work out? We've got this contract in place before the buyer makes an offer, blah, blah, blah. So have those conversations.
So related to that, so related to that point, here's a question, and wouldn't the buyer have to pay taxes if they are being given money to pay another person? So this ties into what Monica said. So we were on a panel for Greater Providence a few weeks ago, and there was a mortgage banker there. And so to Monica's point, you want to have the conversation, like how should these things all sort of be handled? Because if I remember correctly, it was his recommendation that the seller should pay the buyer broker and not the seller paying the buyer so the buyer can pay the buyer broker. And it's because how it all sort of handled on the settlement sheet and all of that stuff. So this is, to Monica's point, why you want to have a conversation about how it makes the most sense for that to be handled, because this particular gentleman implied that it would be better for the seller to pay the broker directly.
Mm-hmm. The other thing too, we have some questions, we see some logistical questions about, how are checks cut at closing? If you're used to the system, now I know in some parts of the state, the closing attorney would normally cut a check to a listing broker, then the listing broker pays the cooperating broker. Other parts of the state, there are two separate checks issued. I would expect two separate checks issued. But this is another thing too. There's some closing attorneys who are super on the ball, paying a lot of attention to this. They really specialize in this area. If someone is kind of someone's friend and sort of dabbling in closings, you want to have that conversation with the closing attorney too up front to make sure. But yeah, I definitely see two checks cut at closing will become the prevailing practice.
So we're actually at time. So yeah, isn't that something? So there are a ton more questions in here. So we'll try to grab these. And what we like to do is enhance our FAQs as we can and with these. Oh,
John, before you do the next one, let me just say, before our communications and marketing director gets mad at us, we do have another of these. If you're not sick of us already, or if you have new questions, on August 14th, right? We're doing another, or did I just get the date wrong?
August 14th. That's the day we go live, and we have another one of these then as well. So
yeah, so it might be part support group, but yes, we will be here on the 14th, and watch your email for more information about what time that all is. So why don't we do this? Let's thank everybody for, John, can we hang out for a few minutes to answer questions, or what do you want to do?
You want to keep going for, yeah, that's fine. We can take a few more. So as folks want to leave, by all means, thank you for being here, and we'll just stick around and try to
thank you so much.
Knock out some more of these questions.
We really appreciate you as members, and hope that we continue to prove our value to you, because we don't want to lose you. Okay, so we'll try a few more questions.
Yeah, and to the point of one of the questions that said, asked us if have you guys ever sold real estate? No, we haven't. Nope. So gee, I'm sorry if I mean, we're doing our best to sort of give you guidance in the context of the settlement and that, but obviously practitioners, you folks are the ones who are going to have to deal with this and are best to figure out how to incorporate this into the way you do business. We're just trying to share with you what we've heard and what we've learned along the way.
And I would suggest, if you haven't already, taking an ABR class. I know some brokerages are doing role playing, things like that, but really the actual explanations you're going to give to customers and clients, I mean, that's going to be peer to peer. And I'll say one thing, this might sound snarky, but I'm just going to mention it anyway. You know who else doesn't list and sell and help people buy real estate? Attorneys for the Department of Justice and plaintiffs' attorneys. Yet they have a huge amount of clout in this situation. And, I wish that were the case, that they had more details about the day-to-day life that all of you are dealing with, but they don't. And yeah, okay.
So here's one. I mean, this is sort of, if a buyer enters into an exclusive agreement with two different realtors, who is entitled to compensation after a sale? I mean, it's sort of the same as if they had entered into do two agreements on the listing side, right? It's not, understanding that procuring cause is sort of out the window now. I mean, it's, and I mean, here's why I guess, here's an argument for now that compensation, when compensation was in the MLS, you sort of had your quote unquote guarantee, right? That was your offer of compensation. If the broker didn't pay, you go to arbitration and there's an award for your performance as procuring cause. Well, now that goes away, right? So now if the listing broker is offering, I mean, this is an argument for, I guess, making it transactional and trying to get that into the P&S agreement, right? So that it becomes part of the transaction itself, because you don't have that assurance now if for some reason there's a dispute between brokers or whatever, that right now there's still an arbitration requirement, but I don't know that that's going to survive. I don't really know how that works because compensation is outside of the MLS. So it becomes a contractual matter where I guess if a buyer has signed two different agreements, technically they can be found to have to pay both brokers, right? It would be up to the courts to decide.
Yeah, I mean, then it becomes a contractual issue where procuring cause, I mean, I think in the long run, it'll, where people have contracts. I mean, you don't really see procuring cause on the sellers, on the listing side. You see a seller who might have signed more than one exclusive contract, sometimes by mistake, sometimes they're just not, whatever. But yeah, so maybe a positive side might be some reduction, but.
So here's one we should have addressed too. Do the current commission offerings in MLS stand for properties that are already active under contract or pending? Yes. The answer is yes. So if you're pending, if you're under contract and the listing doesn't close until after the 14th, you're still entitled to that compensation under the old rules, right? So you want to make sure you have a copy of that listing agreement. Of the listing from MLS, print it out, stick it in your file so that you have evidence that, yes, the listing broker offered blank and that you're entitled to blank. You may even want to go the extra mile and just, email the listing broker, and just say, listen, just to be clear, we both understand that the obligation to pay will it will happen after the 14th or whatever. Just something to reaffirm that you both understand that, yes, you are obligated to pay that amount.
And John, I've got a quick one about on the buyer. It was a question about the purchase and sales agreement. That's section 18. Don't worry, you don't have to pull it out. That's just the professional services fee. So there was a checkbox that the buyer, cooperating broker, will or will not be paid according to a separate contract by the buyer. And so the question was, well, won't everybody have a separate buyer contract? They're certainly required to, but like I said, that's a provision that might go away in the future. But right now everyone's still trying to educate lenders, mortgage brokers, and closing attorneys, in addition to consumers. So it's just trying to driving home that point that, like, hey, remember that things are changing and check out the compensation.
Yep. So there's a question about commercial listing forms are required to change as well. The answer is yes. I mean, again, compensation goes away on all property types. So, you'd have to do the same amendment, any amendments we're talking about, as far as cooperative compensation is across property types.
Mm-hmm.
If your seller is willing to let you offer cooperating compensation, would you include that in section 7 of your listing agreement? So If your seller is allowing you to offer cooperative compensation, you need to have the seller's authorization, right? It has to be in writing and signed by the seller. So you could do that as a separate amendment, or you could incorporate that into section 7, which was the other professional services or additional professional services or whatever that was.
Mhm. Let's see. Oh, yeah, actually, we have a question. I do want to mention this one. There are a couple on the same theme. If the buyers don't have, where'd it go? So the worst, kind of the worst case scenario that the buyer signs a contract, the seller isn't willing to pay concessions, pay the cooperating broker. How do you get paid? And actually, one of our realtors who is listening today made a suggestion. Payment plans. I know it's going to sound super out of touch since we
There
don't
comes that
practice
question. Have
real
you ever
estate.
sold real estate, Monica? Have you ever sold
I know.
Here you come.
But I'm going to say I've actually spoken to some closing attorneys and have been on a panel discussion with a couple. And yeah, I'm not suggesting it's ideal, but yeah, if it's accounted for, and maybe that goes back to the earlier question, would there ever be a time on the closing statement where you'd show compensation coming from the buyer's side? Yeah, as long as it's reflected on the closing statement, I mean, can you agree to do a payment plan? Yeah,
So,
talk to the closing attorney.
right. What if a buyer refuses to sign the agreement, right? You're at that point, it's like, hey, I just need to sign off. Even if you draft the super simple, 2-paragraph, 2-sentence form, what if they refuse to sign? I mean, under the settlement, you're not permitted to show that property, right? But you have I guess, a risk assessment you have to, you're required under MLS rules and under the settlement to have that form. So you'd be in violation.
Yeah, one person said, I'm trying to see if there are any that we haven't generally answered. One person commented, it feels like the end of the buyer representation era. I'd
Let's hope
say
not.
significantly different. Yeah, we hope not, because there's certainly a need for your services. But I think, again, like my crystal ball is, I think there's got to be a change in the financing somehow to make this possible. Because if you get a buyer's doing 100% financing, where are they getting the money? They don't have money for a down payment. Where are they getting the money? Yet they should have representation. Yet
Yeah.
whoever's helping them should be paid by somebody.
There
So,
definitely needs to be finance reform. And there also may be varying business models that we see come up on the buyer side now, right? You have a menu of services in some cases on the listing side, or tiered services. And so maybe you start to see that model on the buy side, where you've got a tiered service that, you want to simply tour some homes, it's X. Now you want to upgrade your services and you want me to negotiate, or et cetera, then it'll be an additional Y, or those types of things, and so that may be an option that some businesses explore.
yeah, I'm trying to see if
I
there's
think we
anything.
probably need to wrap it up, though. It's 10
Yeah, I
minutes
think
past the hour now. And
I know. I think actually can I just take one and then, or we
sure.
could both answer this one.
I'm not the
Then
boss
I'll
of you,
stop.
Monica. You do what you need to do. Go ahead.
Oh, John, I obey your instructions here. So
Yeah,
anyway,
go ahead.
so when is the Department of Justice expected to accept or deny the settlement agreement? If denied, what happens then? So that's why I want to
Yeah.
mention that.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, because they technically don't accept or deny, right? They have no, they can issue a position statement, but they're not the final authority. They get no say, right? It's the court that issues the final okay in, what is it, November? I forget the date, but
I
once
think
the
it's right
court,
around Thanksgiving.
yeah,
Lovely.
happy Thanksgiving. So once the court decides, if the court says yay or nay, and then, the DOJ, what they would have to do is just, start their own action. I guess they'd have to file their own lawsuit, right? Or something. But they
Yeah,
don't get to
right.
give approval of the settlement, right? They try to influence the judge to their
Right.
way of right. So that's why they do the opinions, and that, hoping that the judge won't approve it. But if the judge does, then now.
Yeah, so if for some reason, because it's going before the same judge who already approved it, he was the trial judge in that Missouri case with the nearly $5.4 billion verdict. So he granted preliminary approval already. And so what they'll do is once they start sending out these postcards sometime after August 17th, at that point, the Department of Justice, different agencies, people can submit comments to the court. So if there's something like, significantly different, I suppose he could decide, the judge Boo could decide he doesn't want to grant final approval. If that happened, it would be really what happened in the MLS PIN case, that they'd have to go back and see if they need to make additional changes to the settlement agreement.
Yeah, and so if we could just sort of be frank, I mean, we don't know, we're not parties to the transaction,
No.
but so far the only thing that the DOJ is really speaking out on in the settlement is the continued offer of cooperative compensation, right? So
Correct.
that's just, which is, this carved out as saying it's still permitted. So if the court were influenced by that, and then the parties want, okay, well, what's logical? They take that out, right? So it sounds like,
Yes.
worst case scenario, most likely worst case scenario is that settlement is agreed upon, but now cooperative compensation isn't permissible, right? All the more reason why, when we're talking about how you sort of move forward in this, you figure out a pathway that's not sort of the continuation of the old model, right? So that you're prepared, in the event that that does happen. But I think that's, if the DOJ has any influence, that's probably the most likely outcome. Cooperative compensation goes away.
And that's where we're kind of suggesting rip off the Band-Aid now, but consider doing that. I mean, each brokerage has to make its own decision
Correct.
about what's right for that. But
That's right.
so a few people put in the Q&A, they wanted to know when the video this will be available. I'm thinking by the close of business on Wednesday, our communications department will just take a look at this and they'll post it as soon as it's available. But I think, we want to thank you all for giving a big chunk of your afternoon with us.
Appreciate it. Yes.
Great
Thank you very
questions.
much.
And yeah, and please reach out to either one of us. Who else should we contact?
Yeah, and I think what we'll do probably on the 16th, right? 16th, 14th. Sorry. Yeah, I told you I was getting woozy. On our next one on the 14th is we probably won't even go into the slides. I think that one's really just going to be,
Just all
hey,
Q&A.
here we are. It's day one of the new sort of new world, and just leave it open for questions. I mean, at this point, I think we've all seen the slides a million times. So that probably seems the best use of our time. And I think maybe that one's only an hour anyway. So we'll just dig right into questions. So come back and we'll be here for you and try to help you through this.
Yeah.
Thank you once again,
Sure,
everybody. Have a
everyone.
good afternoon.
Bye.